Captain Do-hyun Lee had been commanding the destroyer Incheon's Pride for 2 years, and he thought he had seen everything the human fleet had to offer. He was wrong. The shipyards orbiting Mars had always been busy. Even during peacetime, humanity had maintained a steady production of vessels for exploration and defense. But what Do-hyun saw now defied belief. The orbital space around the red planet had been transformed into something that looked like a swarm of mechanical insects, all working with desperate speed. "Captain, we're receiving updated orders," his communications officer said. "We're to dock at Yard 7 and await refit." Do-hyun guided his ship toward the designated yard, weaving between dozens of other vessels doing the same. As they approached, he got a better look at what the yards were actually building, and his breath caught in his throat. Ships, hundreds of them, thousands of them. They were everywhere in various stages of construction. But these were not the sleek, well-armored destroyers like his own command. These were something else entirely. Engineer Ji-won Nam came aboard the Incheon's Pride 6 hours later. She looked like she had not slept in days, which was probably true. Her uniform was stained with grease and her eyes were bloodshot. But she moved with the kind of focused energy that came from believing in what you were doing. "Captain Lee," she said, shaking his hand. "I'm here to explain the new doctrine." She pulled up schematics on the ship's main display. Do-hyun stared at what he was seeing and tried to make sense of it. "This is a warship?" he asked. "We're calling them strikers," Ji-won said. "Each one is basically an engine, a pilot compartment, and enough missiles to cripple a heavy cruiser. They're cheap, they're fast, and we can build 50 of them in the time it takes the Draxians to build one proper warship." Do-hyun walked around the holographic display, studying the design from every angle. The striker was barely larger than a fighter craft. There was almost no armor. The living space was so cramped that the pilot would have to stay in their seat for the entire deployment. Life support was minimal. It was in every traditional sense a terrible warship. "They're death traps," he said. "Yes," Ji-won agreed simply, "but there are death traps, and we're building them by the thousands. The Draxians fight like artists, Captain. Every one of their ships is a masterpiece of engineering. They fight with honor and precision and 5,000 years of tactical doctrine." She smiled, and there was something cold in it. "We're going to teach them what happens when art meets industry. When honor meets mathematics. When 5,000 years of tradition runs into 300,000 angry humans who don't care about dying pretty." Over the next 3 weeks, the transformation continued. Every factory on Earth that had built cars now built weapons. Every shipyard that had constructed cargo haulers now produced strikers. Civilians volunteered for military service in numbers that overwhelmed the recruitment centers. The economy of every human world shifted overnight to total war production. Do-hyun watched it all from Mars and tried not to think about what it meant. Humanity was burning everything they had built to fuel this war. There would be no going back from this, regardless of whether they won or lost. Lieutenant Hyun Park reported for duty on a rainy Tuesday morning. She was 24 years old and had been a civilian cargo pilot exactly 1 week ago. Now she was climbing into the cockpit of a striker, listening to a grizzled sergeant explain how the weapon systems worked. "You've got 12 missiles," the sergeant said. "Fire them all at one target, and you can crack a Draxian cruiser's shields. Maybe even punch through the hull if you're lucky and they're stupid. And then," Hyun asked, "and then you die, probably. Or you run. But mostly you die." The sergeant patted the side of the striker like it was a dog. "These things aren't meant to survive combat, kid. They're meant to win it. There's a difference." Hyun wanted to ask more questions, but the sergeant was already moving on to the next pilot. There were 3,000 strikers in her battle group alone, and every single one of them needed a pilot who understood their job was to hit hard and probably not come home. She ran through the pre-flight checklist, her hands shaking slightly. The striker's cockpit smelled like new plastic and metal. Everything was cramped and uncomfortable. There was barely room to move. This was nothing like the spacious cargo hauler she had flown just days ago. But when she fired up the engines and felt the power thrumming beneath her, she understood. The striker was not designed for comfort or survival. It was designed for one thing only: killing Draxian ships. The Draxian Fourth Fleet was one of their proudest formations. 200 warships, each one a work of art. Their admiral was a celebrated war hero named Krell, who had fought in a dozen border conflicts over his long career. He had never lost a battle. When his sensors detected the approaching human fleet, he actually laughed. 3,000 ships. The humans were sending everything they had, and it still would not be enough. His vessels were superior in every way. Better shields, better weapons, better armor, better crews. All ships combat formation Delta, he ordered. We'll destroy them in waves. Make sure the recordings are clean. I want the other species to see what happens when primitives challenge their betters. The human fleet did not slow down. They came on in a vast swarm, no formation that Krell could recognize, no strategy that made sense. It looked like chaos given direction and purpose. All ships open fire, Krell commanded. The Draxian fleet fired as one, and the results were exactly what he expected. Human ships died by the dozens, then by the hundreds. They burst apart under the superior Draxian weapons like bubbles popping. It was a slaughter, but the humans kept coming. Hyun Park felt her striker shudder as the ship next to her exploded. The pilot had been a woman named Sora. They had trained together for 6 days. Now she was gone, atomized by a Draxian plasma cannon. Squadron 7, break left and engage target Baker 4, her squadron leader ordered. His voice was calm, like he was discussing the weather instead of flying into hell. Hyun followed the order, her fingers dancing across the controls. The striker responded beautifully, diving and weaving through the fire. Around her, hundreds of other human ships were doing the same thing, all converging on a single Draxian heavy cruiser. Fire everything on my mark, the squadron leader said. Mark Hyun triggered all 12 missiles at once. The striker lurched as the weapons launched, joining hundreds of other missiles streaking toward the same target. The Draxian cruiser's point defense systems tried to stop them. They succeeded in destroying maybe half the incoming missiles. The other half hit home. The cruiser's shields flashed and died. The hull buckled. Atmosphere vented into space. The massive warship, which had taken 5 years to build and had served the Draxian Empire for 3 centuries, broke apart in seconds. Target destroyed, someone said over the comms. Moving to Baker 5. Admiral Krell watched in growing horror as his fleet died around him. The humans were not fighting like any enemy he had faced before. They did not care about preserving their forces. They did not maneuver for advantage. They simply came on like a tide, drowning his ships in missiles and bodies. For every human vessel he destroyed, 2 more took its place. His beautiful formations, perfected over millennia, meant nothing against an enemy who fought like insects, like locusts, like a swarm that could not be stopped because killing part of it only made room for more. All ships fall back to Rally Point Theta, he ordered, and heard the defeat in his own voice. But there was nowhere to fall back to. The humans were everywhere, surrounding his fleet, cutting off escape routes. They moved with no coordination that he could see, and yet they were perfectly coordinated in the way a school of fish is coordinated. Each ship knew its role without needing orders. The 4th Fleet died over the course of 6 hours. 200 Draxian warships reduced to debris and radiation. The humans lost 2,983 strikers. 17 survived. Hyun Park was one of them. When the battle ended and the Draxian fleet was nothing but wreckage, she sat in her cockpit and shook. She had fired all her missiles in the first engagement. After that, she had simply tried to survive, dodging fire and watching her fellow pilots die. All surviving units returned to base, the order came through. Hyun pointed her striker toward home and tried not to think about the empty spaces where her squadron should have been. 3,000 had gone into battle. 17 were coming back. By any traditional measure, it was a catastrophic loss. But the Draxian 4th Fleet no longer existed. By the measure that mattered, it was a complete victory. News of the battle spread through the Galactic Council within hours. Military analysts from dozens of species studied the engagement, and their conclusions were all the same. The humans were fighting a type of war that the galaxy had not seen in thousands of years. They were fighting like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Sora Bayek stood before the council as a civilian analyst and explained what the military experts could not understand. Humanity evolved as persistence hunters, she said. Our ancestors would pick a prey animal and follow it for days, weeks if necessary. They would chase it until it collapsed from exhaustion. We don't give up. We don't know how to give up. And now you've made the entire Draxian Empire our prey. Overseer Thelnax listened to the report and felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Fear. Not for himself, but for the galaxy itself. What had they unleashed? Commodore Taejin Song looked at the star map and smiled. The Draxian Empire sprawled across 47 systems, each one marked in red. They were wealthy systems, productive systems, systems that had known peace for centuries. That was about to change. "What are your orders, sir?" his tactical officer asked. "We're going hunting," Taejin said simply. His fleet was different from the swarms that had destroyed the Fourth Fleet. Those had been cheap, disposable weapons designed to overwhelm through numbers. Taejin commanded raider groups built for speed and stealth. Each ship was crewed by volunteers who understood they were going deep into enemy territory, with no support and little chance of rescue if things went wrong. They went anyway. Scout Yuna. Han operated from a modified cargo ship that looked like any other civilian vessel. She had been drifting through Draxian space for 3 weeks now, mapping supply routes and identifying targets. The Draxians barely noticed her. Why would they? She was just another trader, moving goods between their wealthy worlds. Except instead of cargo, her holds were filled with sensor equipment and communications gear. Every Draxian fuel depot she passed, she recorded. Every military supply convoy she tracked. Every weakness in their vast empire she catalogued and reported back to human command. The Draxians had built their empire on the assumption that their interior was safe. They projected power outward toward their borders, never imagining that an enemy might slip past their defenses and strike at their heart. Yuna sent her latest report and watched as 3 Draxian fuel tankers passed by her ship. Each one carried enough fuel to power a dozen warships for months. They traveled with minimal escort because they were deep in Draxian territory. No enemy had struck here in over 1,000 years. 20 minutes after the tankers passed, human raider ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and destroyed all 3 vessels in under 4 minutes. By the time Draxian reinforcements arrived, the raiders were gone, already jumping to their next target. The Draxians scrambled to respond, but they were fighting an enemy they could not predict. The humans did not attack military targets exclusively. They hit fuel depots and food shipments and communication relays. They struck sensor arrays and mining operations and civilian infrastructure that supported the war effort. Each attack was small. Each loss was minor, but there were dozens of attacks every day, across all 47 systems, and the cumulative damage began to mount. On Earth, President Yoon Choi reviewed the casualty reports and felt the weight of every number. Human losses were climbing into the hundreds of thousands now. Every day brought new names to add to the memorial walls. Every day brought new families destroyed by war. "We're winning," Fleet Admiral Hajin Park told her during their daily briefing. "The Draxian Empire is fracturing. Their supply lines are collapsing. Their fleet is scattered and ineffective. At this rate, we can force a surrender within 6 months." "At what cost?" Yoonji asked quietly. Hajin did not answer immediately. He was a military man, trained to think in terms of strategy and victory. But he was also human, and he understood what she was asking. "Every cost imaginable," he finally said. "But if we stop now, New Seoul meant nothing. All those deaths meant nothing. We have to see this through." Yoonji nodded, knowing he was right, but hating it anyway. Total war meant exactly what it sounded like. There was no half measure. There was no acceptable compromise. There was only victory or extinction. Medical officer Sun-Ho Kang worked in a hospital ship that followed the raider fleets, treating the wounded as they came back from each engagement. He had been a pediatrician before the war. Now he spent his days treating plasma burns and radiation sickness and trauma that no medical school had prepared him for. The wounded kept coming. Pilots who had flown 30 consecutive missions and could barely remember their own names. Infantry who had fought on 4 different worlds and flinched at every loud noise. Ship crews who had not seen their families in over a year and might never see them again. But Sun-Ho also saw something else. He saw the way they volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. He saw the way they pushed themselves past every reasonable limit. He saw the way they looked at pictures of New Seoul and hardened their resolve. Humanity was not fighting this war because they wanted to. They were fighting because the alternative was to accept that their lives did not matter, that their deaths could be dismissed with a reprimand and a token fine. They were fighting to prove that when you pushed humans to the edge, they did not break. They sharpened. "Dr. Kang," a nurse called out. "We've got incoming wounded from the raid on Draxis 7. 23 casualties, multiple critical." Sun-Ho took a deep breath and went back to work. The war ground on. Deep in Draxian space, the Empire's High Command met in emergency session. Lord Marshal Krex, who had laughed at the human declaration of war, was not laughing anymore. The holographic display showed the damage across all 47 systems. Red markers indicated lost facilities. Broken lines showed disrupted supply routes. Entire sections of their infrastructure were simply gone. "How many colonies have we lost?" the Supreme Commander asked. 17, Krex said, his voice hollow. "Not to invasion, but to raids. The humans strike, destroy what they can, and vanish before we can respond. We cannot defend everywhere at once. Then we pull back our fleets, consolidate our forces, and protect our core systems. That is what they want us to do," another officer argued. "Every ship we pull back is a ship that is not attacking their territory. They are baiting us into a defensive posture while they continue to raid with impunity." The Supreme Commander slammed a clawed hand on the table. "Then what do you suggest? We cannot win a war of attrition against a species that breeds like insects and builds ships like toys." The room fell silent. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. The Draxian Empire, which had ruled for 5,000 years, was losing to a species that had joined the galactic community less than a decade ago. "We negotiate," Krex said quietly. "We open diplomatic channels. We offer reparations for New Sol and agree to all their demands." "Absolutely not," the Supreme Commander snarled. "We do not negotiate with primitives. We do not show weakness." "Then we die with our pride intact," Krex said. "Because make no mistake, if we continue this war, the humans will grind us down to nothing. They have already proven they can do it." But the War Council voted against negotiation. The Draxian Empire would fight on, even as the cracks in their foundation grew wider with each passing day. Yunahan watched from her hidden position as a Draxian supply convoy passed through the system. She counted the ships and noted their cargo. Medical supplies mostly, heading to a colony that had been hit hard by human raids. The convoy was heavily guarded, clearly expecting an attack. She sent the information back to command and waited for orders. They came through an hour later. "Do not engage. Let the medical supplies through." Yuna was surprised. This was total war. Every Draxian resource, military or civilian, was a legitimate target. But the orders were clear and she followed them. What she did not know was that President Yoonji Choi had personally made that decision. The medical supplies were being tracked and human intelligence knew exactly where they were going, to treat Draxian civilians injured in the crossfire of human raids. Yoonji had drawn a line. Humanity was at war with the Draxian Empire and its military. But they would not become monsters. They would not target civilians deliberately. They would not stoop to the level of those who had burned New Sol. The galaxy needed to understand that humanity could be ruthless, yes, but they could also show mercy. The difference between the two was a choice, and humanity was choosing to remain human even in the depths of total war. Back at the Galactic Council, the emergency sessions continued. Species that had been neutral were choosing sides. Some supported the Draxians out of fear of what humanity represented. Others quietly supplied information to human intelligence, horrified by what had happened to New Sol and impressed by humanity's restraint. Councillor Ven of the Etherian Communion spoke before the assembly. "We face a choice. We can continue to pretend that the old order still exists, that the Draxians are invincible and that humanity should know their place. Or we can acknowledge reality. The galaxy has changed. There is a new power rising, and it is rising because we failed to deliver justice when it was asked for peacefully." Overseer Thelnax listened and said nothing. He had spent 12,000 years believing in the system, believing that the council represented order and justice. Now he was watching that system fail in real time, unable to stop a war it had helped create. The question was no longer whether humanity would win. The question was what would be left of the galaxy when they did. In a small apartment on Earth, a young girl named Mirai drew pictures of stars. Her mother had died on New Sol. Her father was somewhere in space fighting in the war. She lived with her grandmother now in a world that had been transformed by total war. But she still drew pictures of stars because someone had told her that was what her mother would have wanted. That even in the darkest times, humans looked up and dreamed of better things. The war ground on, and humanity ground the Draxian Empire down day by day, raid by raid, battle by battle. They fought with the patience of predators who knew their prey was already wounded and running. They fought with the certainty of a species that had decided the galaxy would never dismiss them again, and somewhere in the depths of space, in the wreckage of destroyed ships and shattered dreams, the old order died, and something new was being born. Fleet Admiral Ha-Jin Park stood in his office and stared at the intelligence report in his hands. It contained a single target, the Draxian homeworld's orbital infrastructure. Fuel depots, shipyards, communication satellites, everything that made the heart of the Draxian Empire function. Intelligence Officer Minji Ryu had done her job well. The report was thorough, detailed, and absolutely devastating. Destroying these targets would not kill civilians directly, but it would cripple the Draxian economy completely. Millions would starve when the food shipments stopped. Millions more would die when the medical supplies ran out. It would be the death of the Draxian civilization, slow and agonizing. It was exactly the kind of total war that humanity had declared. "Sir?" Minji asked. She had been waiting for his response for nearly an hour. "Do we proceed with the operation?" Ha-Jin set the report down carefully. "Schedule a meeting with the president. I need authorization for this." 3 hours later, he stood in President Yoonji Choi's office along with Ambassador Min-ho Kim, who had been recalled from the council for this exact discussion. The intelligence report sat on the desk between them like a bomb waiting to explode. "This would end the war," Yoonji said, her voice flat. "One strike and the Draxian Empire collapses completely." "Yes," Ha-Jin confirmed. "But the costing—" "I know the cost," Yoonji interrupted. "Millions of Draxian civilians would die." "Not from our weapons directly, but from the consequences of our actions. The question is whether that matters." Minho spoke up for the first time. "It should matter. The Draxians killed 2 million of us in a single attack. But if we do this, if we deliberately create conditions that will kill millions of theirs, what does that make us? How do we win this war without losing ourselves?" The room fell silent. Outside the window, Earth turned peacefully in the darkness of space, ignorant of the decision being made in this small office. A decision that would define what humanity became. "We strike military targets only," Yoonji finally said. "Shipyards, fuel depots used by the military, communications satellites that coordinate their fleet. But we do not touch civilian infrastructure. We do not target their food supply or medical facilities. We remain human, even if it costs us more lives to do so." Ha-Jin nodded slowly. "It will cost us more lives. The Draxians will fight harder when we approach their homeworld. The battle will be bloodier than anything we've faced so far." "I know," Yoonji said. "But we're not fighting this war to become monsters. We're fighting it to prove that humanity matters. That means something or it means nothing." The order went out that night. The human fleet would attack the Draxian homeworld, but with strict rules of engagement. Military targets only. No civilian casualties if they could be avoided. It was a handicap they were giving themselves, a weight they chose to carry. But it was a weight that let them keep their souls. Wing Commander Jun-an received his briefing 3 days later. He would lead the assault on the orbital fortresses defending Draxis Prime, the Draxian homeworld. 5,000 human ships against the last 3,000 Draxian defenders. The Draxians had pulled back everything they had left. This was their final stand, their last chance to prove that the old empire still had teeth. They had turned the space around their homeworld into a fortress, with weapons platforms and minefields and overlapping fields of fire that would turn any attack into a meat grinder. "We go in hard, and we go in fast," June told his squadron leaders. "The Draxians know we're coming. They've had weeks to prepare. This is going to hurt." Lieutenant Boranam, one of his most experienced pilots, raised a hand. "Sir, why don't we just blockade them? Starve them out? We could avoid a direct assault entirely." "Because that would kill civilians," June said simply. "President's orders. We end this with military force, not starvation. We prove we're better than they are." The attack began at dawn, Draxis prime time. 5,000 human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately came under fire from the defensive platforms. The battle was brutal and immediate. Corporal Hana Yu led her boarding team onto a Draxian space station 20 minutes into the battle. The fighting was close quarters and vicious. The Draxians knew every corridor, every room, every defensive position, but they were also terrified. Hana saw it in their eyes as they fought. Not hatred, not rage, but pure fear. They were not fighting invaders. They were fighting the monsters from their nightmares, the species that had destroyed their empire in less than a year of total war. Sector 7 clear. Hana reported, her rifle still raised. Around her, the walls were scorched from plasma fire. Bodies of both sides littered the floor. This was war stripped of all glory, reduced to violence in cramped spaces. All teams, the station is ours, the command came through. Secure the prisoners and move to extraction. Hana's team rounded up the surviving Draxian soldiers. There were 12 of them, wounded and exhausted. One of them, a young soldier who could not have been much older than Hana herself, was crying quietly. Why? The Draxian asked in broken human language. Why do this? You have won. Why keep killing? Hana did not have a good answer. Because they started it? Because New Soul demanded justice? Because total war meant exactly what it sounded like? None of those felt adequate in the face of the young soldier's tears. Because you wouldn't listen when we asked nicely, she finally said, and moved on to the next room. The Battle of Draxus Prime lasted for 18 hours. It was the largest military engagement in galactic history, and the casualties reflected that scale. The humans lost 2,000 ships. The Draxians lost everything. When the orbital defenses fell and the human fleet took up blockade positions around the homeworld, the Draxian Supreme Commander finally opened communication channels. We surrender, the old warrior said, and there was no pride left in his voice. We will agree to any terms. Just stop the killing. Fleet Admiral Hajin Park received the surrender and felt no joy in it, only exhaustion. Cease fire, he ordered. All ships stand down. The war is over. Across the human fleet, soldiers and sailors and pilots sat in their cockpits and stations and simply breathed. Some cried. Some laughed. Most just sat in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that they had survived. Back at the Galactic Council, the emergency session was in chaos. Humanity had won. A species that had joined the galactic community less than a decade ago had brought an ancient empire to its knees in 8 months of total war. The implications were staggering. Overseer Thelnax called for order, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The galaxy had changed, and he could feel the old order crumbling around him. Dozens of species demanded that humanity be sanctioned immediately. They had proven themselves too dangerous to exist freely. They needed to be contained, perhaps even neutralized before they turned their attention to someone else. But others argued differently. Councillor Venn stood before the assembly and spoke with quiet conviction. Humanity did not start this war. They tried diplomacy first. They came to us for justice, and we gave them a reprimand and a token fine. We created this situation through our own arrogance and indifference. They declared total war, someone shouted from the gallery, and then showed mercy when they could have shown cruelty. Venn countered. They could have destroyed the Draxian homeworld completely. They could have killed millions of civilians. They had the power and the justification, but they chose not to. They chose to remain civilized even in the depths of total war. That should tell us something about who they are. The debate raged for hours, but everyone in the chamber knew the truth, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The galaxy had a new power, and that power had proven itself through fire and blood. There was no going back to the way things were. President Yoonji Choi sat in her office and read the final casualty reports. 412,000 human dead, millions wounded, an entire generation scarred by war. The economic cost would take decades to recover from. The psychological cost might never fully heal, but New Soul had been avenged. The galaxy would never dismiss human lives as acceptable losses again. The question was whether the price had been worth paying. Minho Kim stood before her desk waiting for orders. The council wants to negotiate surrender terms, he said. They're asking what humanity wants. Justice, Yoonji said simply. The Draxians pay reparations for New Soul. War criminals stand trial. The contested territories are ceded to human control, and the council itself undergoes reform so this never happens again to any species. They'll fight some of those terms, Minho warned. Let them, Yoonji said, and there was steel in her voice. We proved we can fight. Now we'll prove we can win the peace as well. In a hospital on Earth, Sunho Kang treated the last of the wounded from Draxus Prime. A young pilot who had lost both legs but somehow kept flying her Striker until the surrender was announced. She would live, but she would never fly again. Was it worth it, Doc? She asked him. Sunho thought about all the patients he had treated, all the lives lost and broken. He thought about New Soul burning. He thought about the galaxy that had dismissed those deaths as unimportant. Ask me again in 10 years, he said. when we see what kind of galaxy we've made. The war was over. The killing had stopped. But the consequences of total war would echo through the stars for generations to come, and humanity would carry those consequences, both the victories and the scars, for as long as they reached for the stars. Ambassador Minho Kim walked into the Galactic Council chamber for the first time since declaring total war, and everything was different. He was not alone this time. Behind him marched a full honor guard of human Marines in dress uniform, their boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm. The symbolism was unmistakable. Humanity was no longer petitioning for recognition. They were negotiating from strength. The chamber fell silent as Minho took his position at the central podium. 847 species watched him, and he could feel the weight of their attention. Fear, respect, resentment, curiosity, all of it directed at the species that had changed everything. Honored council members, Minho began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. The war between humanity and the Draxian Empire has ended. The Draxians have surrendered unconditionally. We are here to present the terms of peace. Overseer Thelnax leaned forward in his elevated seat, the crystal being looked older somehow, worn down by the events of the past months. The council is prepared to hear your terms, Ambassador Kim. Minho pulled up a holographic display that everyone could see. The terms were surprisingly simple. The Draxian Empire would cede all contested border territories to human control. They would pay reparations of 5 trillion credits over the next 50 years, with the funds going directly to the survivors of New Sol and their families. All Draxian military officers involved in the New Sol attack would stand trial for war crimes before a neutral galactic court. The Draxian military would be reduced to defensive forces only for the next century. These terms are harsh but fair, Minho said. Humanity did not fight this war to conquer the Draxian Empire. We fought to be heard. We fought to prove that our lives matter. The question now is whether the galaxy has learned that lesson. There was murmuring throughout the chamber. Some species thought the terms were too lenient. Others thought they were too harsh. But no one could argue that they were unjust. The Draxian representative, a different ambassador than before, stood with difficulty. He looked broken, defeated. The Draxian Empire accepts these terms, he said quietly. We have no choice. You have a choice, Minho corrected. You can accept peace with honor, or you can continue fighting and lose everything. Choose wisely. The Draxian sat down without another word. President Yunji Choi watched the proceedings from Earth via live feed. Beside her sat Fleet Admiral Hajin Park and the rest of the War Council. They had won, but the victory felt hollow somehow. 400,000 dead, millions more carrying scars that would never fully heal. Was this what victory looked like? The Council is also prepared to discuss reforms, Thelnax said, his voice carrying a note of resignation. It has become clear that our current system failed to address legitimate grievances before they escalated to war. We are open to human proposals for change. Minho had been waiting for this. Humanity proposes the following. All species, regardless of age or technological level, will have equal voting rights in the Council. Grievances brought before the Council must receive a formal hearing within 30 days. Decisions involving potential military conflicts require unanimous consent from all affected parties. And most importantly, the Council will establish an independent justice system to investigate claims of genocide, war crimes, and mass atrocities. The chamber erupted. Older species protested that this would give too much power to primitive newcomers. Younger species cheered, seeing their own concerns finally being taken seriously. Councillor Venn stood and raised a hand for silence. These proposals are reasonable and necessary. The old system failed. We cannot go back to it. I move that we vote on implementing these reforms. The vote took 3 hours. In the end, the reforms passed by a narrow margin. The galaxy would never be the same. On the site where New Sol once stood, construction crews worked day and night. Builder Junho Sim supervised the project, watching as the memorial took shape. It would be a simple structure of stone and light, with the names of all 2 million dead carved into its surface. At its center would be a garden, because New Sol had been known for its gardens before the fire fell from the sky. Will they remember? Asked one of the younger workers, a man who had lost his sister in the attack. They'll remember, Junho said with certainty. We'll make sure of that. Every species that visits this place will see what happens when justice is denied. They'll see what humanity had to become to be heard. The memorial would stand for 10,000 years if Junho had anything to say about it, a testament to the dead and a warning to the living. Fleet Admiral Hajin Park stood on the deck of his flagship and watched as the human war fleet began its demobilization. Thousands of ships were being decommissioned, their weapons removed, their crews discharged back to civilian life. The massive industrial machine that had built the fleet was slowly converting back to peacetime production, but not completely. Never completely again. We're keeping 20% of the fleet active, he told his staff officers. Enough to defend our territory and respond to threats. We'll never be as vulnerable as we were before New Seoul. And if the council objects? Someone asked. Hajin smiled without humor. Then they've learned nothing and we'll teach them again. The truth was that humanity had changed. They had proven themselves in the fire of total war, and that was not something that could be undone. They were a power now, a force that had to be respected. The galaxy would adjust to that reality or suffer the consequences. Psychologist Kyung Lee worked with the veterans returning from the war. She saw the 1,000-yard stare in their eyes, the way they flinched at loud noises, the nightmares that woke them screaming. War had scarred them deeply. But she also saw resilience. She saw people determined to rebuild their lives. She saw communities coming together to support their returning soldiers. She saw humanity processing the trauma of total war and slowly, painfully, beginning to heal. Does it get better? A veteran asked her during one session. He had been a striker pilot, one of the few who had survived multiple missions. It gets different, Kyung said honestly. The memories don't go away, but you learn to carry them. You learn to live with what you've seen and what you've done, and eventually you find a way to be more than just a survivor. 6 months after the war ended, the Galactic Council convened with its new structure in place. For the first time in 12,000 years, every species had an equal voice. For the first time, younger species could bring grievances without being dismissed. Humanity now held a permanent seat on the Security Council. So did several other species that had been marginalized under the old system. The balance of power had shifted, and it would never shift back. Ambassador Minho Kim addressed the assembly one final time. Humanity does not want to be a conqueror. We do not seek to dominate the galaxy, but we will never again accept being treated as expendable. We will never again watch injustice happen and do nothing. If the council fails to act when genocide occurs, when war crimes are committed, when the strong prey upon the weak, humanity will act. We will remember, and we will intervene. It was not quite a threat, but it was not quite a promise either. It was a statement of fact. The galaxy had a new guardian, and that guardian had been forged in the fires of total war. Overseer Thelnax, who had witnessed the entire transformation, stood and faced the human ambassador. We understand, Ambassador Kim. The galaxy has changed. We have all changed. The question now is whether we can build something better from the ashes of what was. That depends on all of us, Minho said. Humanity has proven what we're capable of when pushed to the edge. Now we'll prove what we're capable of in peace. The session ended, and delegates from 847 species filed out of the chamber, each one processing what had happened. Some with fear, some with hope, all with the understanding that the old certainties were gone. On Earth, in a small apartment in Seoul, a young student named Isol asked President Yoonji Choi a question during a school visit. Was it worth it? All the death, all the suffering, was proving that we matter worth what it cost. Yoonji looked at the young girl and saw the future looking back at her. A future that would inherit the galaxy humanity had fought to change. We didn't want this war, Yoonji said carefully. But we needed to prove that humanity would never again be something that could be safely ignored. That our lives have value, that when injustice happens there will be consequences. She paused, choosing her next words with care. Whether that was worth the cost is not for me to decide. That's for your generation to decide. We made sure there would be a galaxy where you could make that choice. What you do with it is up to you. The student nodded, processing the weight of those words. Yoonji stood and looked out the window at the city below. Seoul had survived the war intact, but it was different now. Everyone was different. Humanity had gone to war as one thing and come back as something else. Harder, yes, but also more certain of their place in the universe. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere up there, beyond the atmosphere, Human ships patrolled the borders of their territory. Somewhere out in the galaxy, species were adjusting to the new balance of power. Somewhere in the council chambers, debates were happening that would never have been possible before. And somewhere in the ruins of New Sol, the memorial stood silent, remembering the dead and warning the living. The war was over. The killing had stopped. But the consequences would echo through the stars for generations. Humanity had forced the galaxy to acknowledge them, had proven their worth through blood and fire and unrelenting determination. The question now was what they would do with that power, whether they would use it to build something better or become the very thing they had fought against. Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never dismiss human lives again. Never again would they be treated as expendable. Never again would justice be denied with a reprimand and a token fine. Humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson written in fire and paid for with blood. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten for 10,000 years. And in the end, perhaps that was worth the cost. Perhaps that was what total war had really been about. Not conquest, not revenge, but recognition. The simple, terrible truth that sometimes you have to break the world to make it see you. Humanity had broken the old galaxy. Now they would help build the new one. The stars waited, indifferent and eternal, while below them a species that had learned to hunt across continents now hunted justice across the cosmos, and the universe would never be the same.